Hello all, welcome back to the channel. Thanks so much for tuning in. We are at the final week of the regular season for the 2022 college football season, and I have the week 13 picks loaded up and ready to go. Before we get to that though, it has been 2 weeks since I've done picks. I did my picks on my Facebook page last week because I just didn't have enough time to get them done prior to the games starting. I did make picks from last week, but the last time I had a video was for week 11's picks. So let's review each of the last 2 weeks and how I did, which, to be perfectly honest, I'm actually quite pissed about this because I didn't do as well as I wanted to. If we go back to week 11, I finished 13-8 overall, which is not good, at least in my mind. I got, surprisingly, Kentucky losing to Vanderbilt wrong. The hell is that? I got Tulane versus UCF wrong. I recall saying in the previous week's video, or in that week's video, that I could not find any definitive information about UCF quarterback John Reese Plumlee and his injury, and that I was going to assume he was going to be out of the game, but if I knew he was going to start, I would have gone with UCF. Well, guess what happened? He played, he started, he played well, and UCF won that game. NC State lost surprisingly at home to Boston College. What the hell is that bull crap? UCLA lost a game at home to Arizona. What the hell is that all about? Oregon lost a game to Washington, which had me so angry that I was about to go into conniptions. I was so angry at that game. Oregon had a 20-play drive that took up 10 minutes of the clock and kicked a field goal to go up by 7 points, and within a minute, Washington marched down the field and scored and tied the game. Where was Oregon's defense? I thought head coach Dan Lanning was supposed to be a defensive guy, and yet his defense just has a massive brain fart at the most crucial moment of the game and lets them fucking score. I was so angry, and I'm still angry about that one. I also got TCU over Texas wrong. I had predicted that Texas was going to win that game. And once again, TCU just proves me wrong. They just showed that they are immune to adversity, is what it seems. In that week, in week 11, I was 0-4 in my top 25 picks. 0-4. That is absolutely absurd and just enraging to me. So after week 11, I was 135-36 overall in my picks and 21-12 in my top 25 picks. There were no top 10 matchups in week 11, so I was still 5-1. If we fast forward then to week 12, I started out 14-1. I was 14-1 when the 7 o'clock games started. There were 8 of those late games. And I went 2-6 in those games. So I finished 16-7 overall. And I'm really just fucking pissed about having such milquetoast performances the last 2 weeks. Especially last week when I started out so strong and I just bombed those picks at the end of the week. I was 0-2 in my top 25 picks, which means in the last 2 weeks, I'm 0-4 or 0-6 in those picks, which is just unacceptable. I'm 21-14 overall in those picks. I'm 151-43 going into this final week of the regular season. And last week, there were once again no matchups between top 10 teams, so I'm still 5-1 in those matchups. Oklahoma. Where the hell did that come from? Beating the crap out of Oklahoma State. Navy, which has like 3 wins on the season. One of them now is against UCF. Where the hell did that come from? Georgia Tech, again, a team that had 4 wins on the season, beating a 9-win North Carolina team. And then the top 4 teams all struggling. Georgia struggled with Kentucky. Ohio State almost dropped one to Maryland. Michigan escaped with the luckiest of endings against Illinois. TCU needed a field goal as time expired to win over Baylor. And then Tennessee getting their asses handed to them by South Carolina of all teams. Spencer fucking Rattler going off like it's the last game he's ever going to play in his life. A sad postscript to that Tennessee loss, though, is starting quarterback Hendon Hooker is out of the game and out of the season with an ACL injury. So his season is done, which is really sad, and I feel bad for the kid because he was playing phenomenally. His team is having an amazing season. Just a bad way to end it, and just leaving a bad taste in Tennessee's mouth that game. Just all around. Getting their asses handed them by an unranked team, losing their starting quarterback for the season to an injury. Just not good all around. I feel really bad for Hendon Hooker having to deal with that injury in this particular season. He seems like he's one of the good kids in college football. That means, as I said, 151-43 overall, 21-14 in my top 25 matchups, and 5-1 in matchups between top 10 teams going into the regular season finale, week 13 of the college football season. It's been a good season. There's been a lot of phenomenal games. The last few weeks have been incredibly frustrating. I'm hoping that this week goes better so I can end on a strong note and not constantly be ready to put my fist through a wall like I was each of the past 2 weeks. We've got a huge top 10 matchup in the Big Ten that has not only conference championship ramifications, but also has playoff ramifications. We've got some rivalry games that are going to be hard to call for this week because even though on paper it might look like one team is clearly superior, these are rivalry games and weird shit happens in rivalry games. So that's going to cause me to think twice about some of these picks. Some picks I'm making with high degrees of confidence, others not really at all. We are going to begin, though, with a high-confidence pick, the number 1 Georgia Bulldogs. They have already cemented their spot in the SEC championship game. They will be taking on LSU in that championship game. They are 11-0 on the season. They are taking on in-state rival Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech coming off that win against North Carolina last week. They are not going to make it 2 wins against ranked teams in a row. Georgia is going to win this game. I believe that they're going to win this game handily. And because Georgia Tech was one of the picks I got wrong, I kind of hope that they mop the floor with Georgia Tech this week. Look for Georgia to go to 12-0 and head in to the SEC championship game undefeated. The biggest matchup on the weekend, and one of the biggest matchups of the entire season, number 2, the Ohio State Buckeyes at 11-0, hosting the number 3 Michigan Wolverines, also at 11-0. Let's take a look at the stats for this game. In terms of rush yards per game, Michigan is a bit better than Ohio State, 243 to 203. In terms of pass yards a game, Ohio State is a little bit better than Michigan, 284 to 208. In terms of rush defense, Michigan is better than Ohio State, 79 to 107. In terms of pass defense, Ohio State is a little bit better than Michigan, 158 to 161 per game. In terms of third down, Ohio State is a little bit better than Michigan, 47% to 46%. Their defense is a little bit better on third down, 29% to 30%. Both teams have a handful of turnovers against them, and they have some turnovers in their favor. Ohio State wins that battle. They've got 17 total turnovers in their favor to 11 for Michigan. So in terms of the stats, these teams are pretty equivalent. So I think we need to look elsewhere for how we're going to call this particular game. And one of the directions we can look is injuries. Because last week was costly for both teams. In the Michigan win against Illinois, starting running back Blake Corum, who is a Heisman Trophy candidate this year, or at least he is one that a lot of people say should be a Heisman Trophy candidate this year. He only ran the ball one time in the second half and then was gone for the rest of the game with a knee injury. During the week, head coach Jim Harbaugh did not give out any news about Blake Corum, as you would expect because they don't ever give out solid injury information. As I have learned, much to my chagrin, a few times this season. He did mention that there was no structural damage, which is a good thing, but he did not confirm whether or not Corum was going to play in the Ohio State game. However, one of his offensive linemen seemed to indicate that Corum was going to be out of the game and that his backups would be in. Whether or not that's the case, I don't know. He's officially listed as day-to-day. I am going to do the opposite of what I've been doing recently with these injury reports and assuming that Corum is in fact going to play. It's the game. It's the biggest game Michigan's played all season. It is the one that is the key to other things Michigan wants to do, like a Big Ten title conference, championship, and a playoff spot. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that Blake Corum is going to play in this game. The big question is going to be, how effective will he be? Will he tweak that knee injury again? Is it going to slow him down? Is it going to stop his ability to make cuts? How is it going to affect him throughout the game? On Ohio State's side, their starting running back, Travion Henderson, didn't play for much of the game versus Maryland, and he was on the sidelines in a walking boot, which is pretty serious. His backup running back, Williams, didn't play because he was injured in the previous game, so they relied on their third-string quarterback, a freshman who ran for 146 yards and played very well. But that's Maryland's run defense. That ain't Michigan's run defense. So I don't think Ohio State's going to be able to rely on the same kind of production from that kid against Michigan that they got out of him against Maryland this past week. Which means if their starting running back can't go, if their backup running back can't go, CJ Stroud, the quarterback, is going to have all of the pressure on his shoulders to perform. And he was hobbled a bit in that game against Maryland. In the last couple of series, offensive series for Ohio State, you saw him limping around and walking very gingerly. I don't remember which leg. It looked like, I think it was like his left leg he was dragging out around a little bit. But that's something to keep an eye on for the game against Michigan. I'm assuming that CJ Stroud is going to play. I'm not going to make the same assumption I've made previously and say, well, CJ Stroud probably won't play in this game. No. Not with this one. Not this game. This is the game. That kid's going to play. But again, how well is he going to play? Is he going to be mobile in the pocket? Is he going to be able to plant both feet and put his body weight into his throws to make accurate passes to his good wide receivers? I don't know. So there's some serious injury questions and productivity questions for major players on both sides of this matchup, which makes it hard to call this game. This game is at Ohio State, and last year, they got trucked by Michigan. They got beat up by Michigan. Their offensive and defensive lines got manhandled by Michigan. That's why they fired their defensive coordinator and hired Jim Knowles from Oklahoma State to come in and revamp this defense to make it tougher, to make it more aggressive, to make it nastier, so that they would not experience that again. And so far this season, they've been successful in improving their defense. They are much better this year than they were last year, but are they good enough to beat Michigan? If Blake Corum can't go or is hobbled, unlike last year where they had a two-headed running back tandem in Hassan Haskins as the main starter and Blake Corum as the secondary guy, they don't have that this year. It's Blake Corum or bust. So if they don't have Blake Corum in, they're going to be relying on players that don't have a lot of game experience and have not played much this season. That's going to make things much more difficult for Michigan, and that's going to put a lot more pressure on starting quarterback J.J. McCarthy to have a successful game, which, because Michigan's style of play is play good defense and rely on your running game, he has not had to do at all this season. If you look at his stats over the past few games, he's been very mediocre. He's only thrown the ball for over 200 yards, I think, twice in the last 5 games. He's only had one game that he's thrown for over 300 yards. It was a game against, I think it was a game against Maryland earlier this season. Most of the time, he's completing between 15 and 20 passes, 150, 175 yards, and a touchdown or two. He might, and I'm going to guess that he's going to have to play much better against Ohio State, and he's going to have to throw the ball more, he's going to have to be more accurate, and he's going to have to take more chances if they want to get past the Buckeyes. So this is a revenge game from Ohio State. They've revamped their defense for this particular game. It's at Ohio State. There are injury questions on both sides. The stats don't really give you an indication of who is really got an edge here. So I'm going to rely on the eye test for this one. And Ohio State just doesn't look good. They just haven't looked good this entire season. There have been flashes of greatness, but normally against subpar teams. And then they've had games like they had last week against Maryland. You could argue they were looking over Maryland and Michigan, and I accept that, because you could say the same thing for Michigan in their game against Illinois. But then they've had other games where they've struggled mightily against subpar teams, and yet they've been able to pull it out. And then when you look at some of their common opponents, like the games against Penn State, Michigan had no problems with Penn State at all. They blew them out of the water at home. Ohio State had much more trouble with them on the road than did Michigan. There just seems to be something that's off with this Ohio State team, especially offensively. It just seems like they are not in the same shape that they were expected to be in, that they were in last year. It just seems like there's just something that's not quite clicking. It's like the gears are moving, but they're struggling. They're like grinding against themselves. Because of that, and because Michigan has looked much better offensively, and they've looked much more smooth in all facets of the game, I'm going to go with Michigan in this one to get the win in Columbus and to go back to the Big Ten Championship for the second consecutive year. So go with Michigan in that matchup. So that takes care of both the number 2 and the number 3 picks. That leads us down to number 4, TCU. Coming off that game-winning field goal against Baylor, they return to the friendly confines of, I think they're in Fort Worth is where they're at, to welcome in Iowa State. When you look at the Big 12 championship game scenarios, TCU punched their ticket to the championship game a couple of weeks ago. They're waiting to see who their opponent is, and it's more than likely going to be Kansas State in a rematch of a phenomenal game earlier this season where TCU came back from 18 points down and won that game. They've got to get through. They don't have to win this game against Iowa State because they're already into the Big 12 championship game. They need to win this game against Iowa State to stay in playoff contention. And because the two teams ahead of them are playing each other and one of them has to lose, if TCU wins this game against Iowa State, one would think they would bump up in the rankings a spot probably to number 3. That puts them in a better position because instead of playing the number 1 team in the nation in the semifinals, they'll play the number 2 team in the semifinals, which, I mean, I don't know if you can really call that an easier game, but theoretically that's how it goes. I think they will get the job done. I think the game against Baylor was the game that's going to scare them. I think they'll play better against Iowa State. I think they'll beat Iowa State, and I think they'll complete for themselves an undefeated season heading into the Big 12 championship. Number 5, LSU. They're 9-2 on the year. They are at Texas A&M. 2 of the last 3 years, this has been a very competitive, wild game, including a 7 overtime thriller in College Station a few years ago. I would expect this game to be competitive, even though Texas A&M is having a crap year this year. They're having an unexpectedly bad season this season. I would still expect, because of pride and because of some of the recent history of this game, to be competitive, to be close. It's at Texas A&M after all. They'll have 100,000 fans looking to play spoiler for LSU as they try to make their way to the college football playoff. They're, as I mentioned earlier, already in the SEC championship game, but at number 5, one of the teams above them, Michigan, Ohio State, is going to lose. And then TCU's in a championship game, just like LSU is. If LSU wins this game, they go on and win the SEC. TCU loses the Big 12 championship game and finishes with a loss. It's pretty hard to see a situation where LSU wouldn't get into the playoff at that point. I think LSU is going to win this game. Brian Kelly has turned around LSU quicker than I thought he was going to do. They've played very well this year outside of the Tennessee game. Go with LSU to finish 10-2 on the year and have some momentum going into the SEC title game next week. Number 6, USC, the Trojans at 10-1, coming off that inter-city rivalry game against UCLA that they won 48-45. They are home this week, taking on the number 15 team in the nation, the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Let me get to my stats here for this one. If we look at the stats, Notre Dame is better at running the ball, but just by a bit. USC is much better at throwing the ball, 330 a game to 189 a game for Notre Dame. In terms of defense, USC is better at stopping the run than is, Notre Dame is a little bit better at stopping the run than is USC, and they're much better at stopping the pass than USC. USC is letting up 257 yards a game through the air. USC, though, has fewer turnovers against them, only 4 this season. Notre Dame is a little bit more turnover prone. They've thrown 9 interceptions this season. USC's defense has scored 18 picks this season. USC's better on third down than is Notre Dame. Notre Dame's got a better third down defense, though, than just USC. I think when you look at the schedules, though, Notre Dame has won. They started out 0-2. And they're 8-3 on the year, so they've 7-1 in their last 8 games. And they've won 5 in a row. But if you look at who they've beaten, outside of Clemson, and maybe if you want to consider Syracuse, even though Syracuse has dropped completely off the map after their 5 or 6-0 start, they really haven't fought anyone or played anyone good. They're feasting on scoring a lot of turnovers recently, and they're feasting on running the ball in a lot of games recently. I was looking at the stats for the past 5 games, and they had more turnovers than their opponents in each of those 5 games, and they outran their opponents in 4 of those 5 games. The only one they didn't was the Navy game, where they only racked up 66 yards of rushing, and they had to throw the ball for over 200 yards in order to win by, I think, 1 score. So Navy played them tough. So Notre Dame has been feasting on what's turned out to be actually a relatively weak schedule. I think that matters because USC has played a tougher schedule, including playing a big rivalry game last week against UCLA. However, USC is coming off a big emotional rivalry game against their intercity rival, UCLA, from last week. So one could argue that there can be a major letdown as they're welcoming in a Notre Dame team that is on a winning streak. As I said, 5 in a row, 7 of the last 8. That is turning the ball over on their opponents, that is outrushing their opponents, and is playing good defense. I think, though, that the quality of the opponent matters, and I think Notre Dame has been feasting on teams that, as it's turned out, are not that good. Syracuse isn't that good. Navy is not good. Boston College is not good. Clemson, despite the fact that they're ranked 8th in the nation, I do not believe that they've earned or deserved that ranking because I don't think they're that good. Their defense has been stellar all year, but that defense is getting tired, and they're getting closer and closer and closer to losing games. They were down to Syracuse by 11 points going into the 4th quarter. They lost in a very, very one-sided game against Notre Dame on the road earlier this season. They had to struggle to beat a game Wake Forest team on the road. This is not the Clemson team that won national championships a few years ago. This is a much, much weaker Clemson team that is pulling its starting quarterback in multiple games and letting the backup come in to try to rally them to win games. So I don't think Notre Dame... I think Notre Dame's a nice to good team. I don't necessarily know if they're as good as this 7-1 record in the last 8 and 5-game win streak suggests that they are, however. I'm going to go with USC because I think USC has more to play for in this game. They have already secured their entrance into the Pac-12 championship game. Who their opponent is still yet to be determined by the games this week. They have a shot to not only win their conference championship, but to finish with 1 loss with a conference championship, and depending on how things break in the teams ahead of them, they have a shot to sneak their way into the playoff at the end of the year. Notre Dame with 3 wins, if they win this game, they're 9-3. They're an independent, so they don't have a conference championship to win. They're not going to go to the playoff. Their hope is for the best bowl game they can get. They don't have as much to play for USC. I know USC is still without starting running back Travis Dye, who's out for the rest of the season, but it did not hinder them from scoring 48 points in the win against UCLA. I think Notre Dame is not as offensively gifted as UCLA is. I don't think they're as high-powered as UCLA is, even though they've scored at least, I think, 32 points during this 5-game win streak in every game. Again, against subpar opponents. USC did it last week against a top-ranked, a highly ranked UCLA team. So I'm going to go with the Trojans on this one. Number 7, Alabama in the Iron Bowl game against Auburn. This game always makes for fun watching. Auburn has fired its head coach, Brian Harsin, though, and they've got an interim coach who's won the last 2 games, so they're on a 2-game winning streak. We all know what's on the line in this game. Bragging rights. It's one of the most violent rivalries in college football. I think Alabama is going to win this game because I just don't think Auburn's that good this year. I just don't think they have the talent to beat Alabama. I think Alabama is going to come into this game, even though they don't have that wide receiver threat. I think Bryce Young is going to have enough magic in him left to get one more win for Bama during the regular season. So go with Alabama on this one. Clemson, number 8 in the country at 10-1. They're taking on the South Carolina team that just beat the crap out of Tennessee last week. I don't picture that happening a second straight time. I'm going to go with Clemson on this one, and I'm going to trust that their defense is going to get the job done, and that the offensive performance we saw from South Carolina last week is a one-off. I'm going to go with Clemson, but not with a high degree of confidence. Number 9, Oregon. Their playoff hopes are probably eliminated with that loss to Washington, but their Pac-12 championship hopes are still on the table. They have the easiest path to get into the playoff, or into the conference championship game, excuse me. They are on the road at number 21, in-state rival Oregon State, who's 8-3 on the year. Oregon State is a nice team. It's been nice to see them play well, have a good season, be ranked. They've got a very good defense. They've got a good running attack. And their quarterback does enough to help win games. They played Washington very tough on the road earlier this season. I watched most of that game. That defense kept Michael Penix Jr. in check. The running game was carving up Washington's defense. I think this one's going to be close. I think Washington's offense is very good. I think its ceiling isn't as high as the Oregon offense, though. With Bo Nix being back in the action and seeming like he's healthy, I think Oregon's offense is going to do enough to keep Oregon State's running game on the sidelines and prevent them from playing ball control, from running the clock down, and denying Oregon opportunities. Oregon also has more at stake in this game, because I don't remember exactly what I had read yesterday about the conference championship scenarios, but I think for Oregon, I think it's a simple matter of win and you're in. I might have that. It's either they win and they're in, or they win and Washington has to lose, and then Oregon is in to the Pac-12 championship. But they still have the best, most straightforward shot to get to the championship game and to take on USC. And at least if they don't get to the playoff, say that they won their conference championship game. So I'm going to go with Oregon in that in-state rivalry on the road. Number 10, the aforementioned Tennessee Volunteers. They're at Vanderbilt. If they were playing a better opponent without their starting quarterback, I would call them to lose. But they're playing Vanderbilt, despite the fact that Vanderbilt has won 2 in a row, and they beat Florida on the road for the first time in like decades. I think I saw that stat on ESPN the other day. I still don't think Vanderbilt's a real good team, and even with their backup, I think it's Joe Milton III, the Michigan transfer, is their backup. I think Tennessee is still powerful enough offensively. I don't think Vanderbilt is going to pull a South Carolina. I don't think they're capable of doing that. So I'm going to go with Tennessee to finish off the season at 10-2. Go with the Volunteers. Number 11, Penn State. They're 9-2 on the year. They're taking on my Michigan State Spartans. Michigan State has won a couple of games here now. They beat Illinois. They beat a Wisconsin team earlier this season. I don't think they can stand with the Penn State. Penn State's been blowing people out all season long. So I'm going to go with Penn State to finish the season at 10-2. Go with the Nittany Lions. Number 12, Kansas State. They're 8-3. They're taking on in-state rival Kansas in the Sunflower Showdown. I just learned yesterday that that's what that was called. I didn't know. It makes sense because Kansas, I think, is the Sunflower State, are they not? So Sunflower Showdown makes sense. That's a cute name. I think Kansas State, I think from the bowl game scenarios, I think if they beat Kansas, I think they're in to the championship game against TCU. Kansas has completely fallen off the map since their 5-0 start. Kansas State has gotten stronger as the season's progressed. I'm going to go with Kansas State in that one. Number 13, Washington. They're 9-2. They're on the road at Washington State in the Apple Cup game. Washington State needs to win this game and have a couple of things bounce in their favor to qualify for the Pac-12 title game. I think they've got more to play for. I think their offense is going to get the job done again, just like it did against Oregon. Go with Washington in that game. Number 15, Notre Dame. I've already said I think they are going to lose to number 6, USC on the road. Number 16, Florida State. They're 8-3 on the year. They're taking on Florida. Florida is not real good this year. Anthony Richardson has been playing well at times and not so well at other times. They just got beat by Vanderbilt at home for the first time in quite a long time, like I said. Florida State is trending up, finally, under head coach Mike Norvell. I think this is his third season there already. And he had 2 real crap first seasons, and now they finally seem like they're getting it put together. It's at Florida State. It's a rivalry game, so again, the disclaimer for all these games pretty much is anything can happen because they're rivalry games. I am going to go with Florida State on this one to get the job done. Number 17, North Carolina, coming off that loss against Georgia Tech. They are home against in-state rival number 24, North Carolina State. North Carolina State should not still be ranked at 7-4. I don't believe they should. I think part of the reason they're still ranked is so it can boost Clemson, because I think that the College Football Playoff Committee has some inexplicable love affair with Clemson for some reason, and I don't get it. But North Carolina State should not be ranked after the loss against Louisville on the road last week. They should be out of the top 25. North Carolina, I think, is pissed that they lost a one-loss season and dropped a game inexplicably to Georgia Tech of all teams. Even though this is, once again, a rivalry game, North Carolina State has a freshman QB. North Carolina State's defense is good. North Carolina State's quarterback is in contention for a Heisman Trophy. He didn't play very well last week. I think he makes up for that this week. Go with the Tar Heels to finish off their season at 10-2. Number 18, UCLA. They're on the road at Cal. Cal's got a nice defense, but I don't think it's going to be enough. Go with UCLA to get the job done there. Number 19, Tulane. They are on the road against number 24, Cincinnati. This is a matchup between the number 1 and number 2 teams in the AAC. Whoever wins this game will host the AAC championship game next week. So it's either going to be in New Orleans or it's going to be in Cincinnati. The losing team has to have a couple of other things happen with other games in the American for them to then get in to the championship game for a rematch between these two teams. If we look at the stats in this game, Tulane is a bit better at running the ball than is Central Florida, or than is Cincinnati, excuse me. Cincinnati is better at throwing the ball than is Tulane by a little bit. They both have defenses that can turn the ball over. Tulane is a little bit better Cincinnati's a little bit better at stopping the run than is Tulane. And they're almost exactly the same when it comes to their pass defense. They are almost exactly the same at third down conversion percentage. I've seen Cincinnati play a couple of times this season, though, and I've seen Tulane play a couple of times this season. And the times that I've seen Tulane play, other than the UCF game, they just look really good. I think the eye test is telling me that Tulane's going to win this game. And then Cincinnati, I think, needs a couple of other teams to lose in the American, particularly, I think, UCF, for them to requalify for the championship game. I'm going to go with Tulane in this matchup, but not with a high degree of confidence. Cincinnati's a good team, but it just seems like when Tulane is on, they are on. And they just seem like they have a higher ceiling than does Cincinnati. And Tulane is looking this season at a complete reversal of what happened last season. Last season, they were 2-10, 1-7 in conference. They can, with this win, if they get this game, almost completely reverse that by finishing 10-2, and I think, with only both their losses are in conference, so I think they'd be 6-2 in conference or something this season. So I'm going to go with Tulane in that one. Number 20, Ole Miss. They played last night in the Egg Bowl against Mississippi State. I did say on my Facebook page that I thought Ole Miss was going to win this game, and they did not. As Mississippi State who runs the Mike Leach air raid offense, where they're running the ball for 72 yards a game, ran the ball down Ole Miss's throat, especially in the second half when the rain started, and won that game. Which puts me off to an 0-1 start this week. Combined with how I ended last week, this is really just frustrating. And I was very unhappy sitting on my couch last night watching that pathetic performance from the Ole Miss team. So I've already lost that one. Number 21, Oregon State. I've already said I think they're going to lose to number 9, Oregon. Number 22, Central Florida. They're 8-3 on the year, and their hopes for an American Athletic Conference Championship berth are still there. They have to have something happen with the Tulane-Cincinnati game and with the Houston game, I believe. They are on the road against South Florida in the War on I-4 game. This is always an entertaining game. It always seems to be a fun one to watch. South Florida, I don't think is very good this season. I haven't seen them play, but I haven't heard anything about them, which leads me to believe they're probably having a bad season. I'm going to go with Central Florida to keep their hopes alive for a championship game berth. Number 23, Texas. They are home against Baylor. Baylor lost 2 straight at home, 1 a beatdown to Kansas State, 1 a heartbreaking loss by a field goal to TCU. I think they have a hangover game this week from that loss, and they go on the road and they get beat by Texas, who is still in the running for a Big 12 championship. They have a lot of steps that need to happen, though, for that to take place. But I think the first step is they have to win this game, and I think they will, so go with Texas. And then there's a tie at number 24, because again, first the AP voters, now the College Football Playoff Committee, they're like, well, let's just tie 2 teams. What the hell are you doing? Make a pick, for Christ's sakes. Pick a team. What is with this tie bullcrap? North Carolina State and Cincinnati are both tied at number 24. I've already said that I think both teams are going to lose. North Carolina State, I think they're going to lose on the road against North Carolina. And Cincinnati, I think they're going to lose at home against number 19 Tulane. Again, not with a high degree of confidence in that one, though. And then wrapping up the top 25 for this week is number 25, Louisville. Even though theoretically, if there are 2 teams that are tied for 24, there should be no 25th team. So there's 26 teams this week because of the stupid tie that I just talked about. Louisville, coming off that loss against North Carolina State at home, they are on the road against Kentucky. Once again, for the ACC, I'm going to call an upset on this one. Kentucky played Georgia extremely tough at home just recently. Louisville is on the road. They're getting away from the friendly confines of Louisville. They're going on the road to Kentucky. I think Kentucky's good enough to get the win on this one. It's a rivalry game. This is a heated rivalry, surprisingly. I think Kentucky gets the win and knocks Louisville out of the top 25. And that's going to do it for the picks for the final week of the 2022 regular season. I'm sad that college football is coming to an end soon. I'm looking forward to what we're going to see with bowl games this season, though, and after this week, we will have a much clearer picture of what's going on, not just for championship week, because we'll know who's going to play in those games, but we'll also be able to put together some more solid scenarios for what's going to happen with the playoffs a little bit later on. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in the next video.